And welcome to the afternoon session, which we've deemed the scientific presentation session, part of the session. Although I think you'll see that you know, science today and history, they're going to get blurred a little bit. But in any case, we hope to hear from some of the cutting edge stuff going on in the 7T world and elsewhere. And our first talk of the afternoon is Hans Breiter. You've already heard a little bit about Hans from this morning's session as one of the prime guys behind getting our 7T at the MGH. Hans is now a professor of psychiatry at Northwestern and has had this special role in the project, namely scoring the money, as we call it. More precisely, it was really his groundbreaking research and imaging the reward circuitry of the brain that got us on the radar of the ONDCP and got them interested in this sort of thing, I think, overall. And it's the sort of work that still inspires us, and I'm very eager to hear his plans for computational behavior.
Right. Folks, great to be here. For some of you, it may seem like I took like a 40-year walk through the forest and kind of disappeared. I actually went to Northwestern University. I still continue to spend about a half a day a week at Mass General, a tiny little lab footprint over in building 120, and every so often you'll see me wandering around in the usual haze that I wander around in. I'm going to talk today about something that I've become very passionate about, which is computational behavior. I didn't intend to move into this domain, but as I've moved deeper into computational behavior, I've realized that there's another ground truth that needs to be connected to. So yes, I am now a Tesla addict in a big way. And it also has very interesting implications to AI. All right, quickly, some declaration of conflicts of interest. I have no financial interests or relationships to disclose with regard to the data I'm going to talk about today, although I've got 3 companies in the interpretable artificial intelligence space: Barheit, Toggle, Spark. I always find this very interesting because once you have a conflict of interest, what that means is they put a management plan together for you at like Northwestern University. And that management plan basically means how much of a percentage they can take out of each of these companies. The higher the percentage, the more better you are managed. So just a little note about that. I'm also going to make a note that all the data I'm going to talk about is freely usable for academic purposes by anybody at Mass General, Northwestern, or anywhere, okay? All right. Quick shout out to all the people who've helped out with this. Large number of people, the Wright Adolescent Center, which I direct at Northwestern. And then for a brief bit of time, about 6 years, we had an applied neuromarketing consortium too. What I'm going to talk about, my main thesis, is that each of these domains are very, very fundamental. They need each other. In a sense, they're 3 legs of a stool. Each of them are a ground truth. And the more tightly we can link them, the better we will understand each of these. For a while, I thought we could go after computational behavior without really getting back into imaging. The more I get into this, though, the more I truly, truly feel that we need to be going to 7T and even higher. So when I heard from Larry and Bruce that they wanted to go to 14T, yes, I'm all for it. I want to help you guys get there. Also, with computational behavior, I've gotten a bit into this AI world. And I have to say, with a bit of a caveat, Simkoff and Mandavi also make a point. True AI does not exist. Artificial intelligence, like a human in a machine, is still very much a dream. What we can do is something called machine intelligence, and I'll talk a little bit about some of our forays into this, especially as computational behavior has implications for it. And of course, high field imaging is going to be necessary for this. Understanding how circuits at the micro level function is going to radically change the architectures that can be built. Okay, topics for today, and by the way, I like putting this up here because as a psychiatrist, this is where my field is. We're headless. And without a head, psychiatry is going nowhere. I would like to argue that economics is in the same place. I'm going to start today talking about the origin myth of the 7T. It's very much what Bruce talked about. I'll just add a few minor little details and how that led to a brain model of human addiction. And there were some real problems with it, even though it was a major development. The 2 questions that arose out of it is, what is the mind? And isn't this just the brain? And I'm going to call this like a blue state problem and a red state problem, all right? Kind of a bifurcation, both of them ultimately ending up back to this question of what is AI and how can the 3 be linked together? All right, so in the beginning, there was this very complicated experiment that was put together by Bruce, by Steve Hyman, myself. Many other people had inputs to this: Randy Golub, David Kennedy, Ken Kwong. This was a group effort. No one person shines as the architect of this. We were able to collect behavioral metrics over time as people were being scanned. And for the first time, we could actually see what were called the reward system in a human versus saline, and actually see this activate and see that it actually related to some aspects like the rush versus the craving. Now, why is this important? Well, it gets down to this issue that with the animal model, you could do some very exquisite, mathematically well-defined types of behaviors like positive reinforcement and incentive salience. You saw a very strict set of regions that were involved with this. With this paper now from Randy, myself, Bruce, and others, we could see the same system and connect it to rush and craving. Well, rush is basically the human variant of positive reinforcement. Craving is a human variant of incentive salience. So you've had a two-way interaction between the same systems and the same behaviors, human to animal, seamless. One of the few things having to do with mental disorders where we actually could talk about an animal to human seamlessness. Now, of course, this led to two things. One was a call from Al Brandenstein. I think, Chris, that's you in that picture right there. And then many problems with the brain model started to emerge as we started digging into it more deeply. I'm going to go forward briefly to a little bit about the myth, how this all came about, and then kind of go about the positive things that came out of this, positive things that came out of this. So first off, we had this publication, we got onto the cover of Neuron, and it had this splashy kind of nucleus accumbens, like almost pulsating activation on the cover. A bunch of us go down to Society for Neuroscience and kind of the toast of the field because we've had this wonderful finding of the reward system in humans. Come back, and there on my desk is a note, the White House phoned. Now, I thought I was in big trouble. Why? Because when we were doing these infusion studies, I actually had to write a prescription for cocaine for every single dose that was given. And so I was in the radar for the DEA. I thought I was in trouble. I didn't want to phone the guy back. I saw the note, it was like noon on a Friday, so I delayed. I thought maybe if I wait long enough, maybe 4 o'clock, no one will be there. So I phone at 4 o'clock, someone picks up instantly, Al Brandenstein. And I say, hello, this is Hans Breiter. He says, I know. And he goes on to say who he is. He's the chief technology officer for CTAC and all this. I said, no. And I do imaging. He said, I know. Okay, so there were 2 spooky responses right off the bat. His first question to me when I asked him, what can I do for you? Is he said, do you want a PET scanner? Do you want to know another piece of equipment? And I remember thinking to myself, no, don't want a PET scanner at this time. But there were things like 4.7 Teslas out there that maybe we could use for addiction imaging, but the best person to talk to was the guy who's hiding behind Larry over there. And so I said, Al, I want you to talk to my boss, my mentor, Bruce Rosen. When I have some free time in 2 or 3 weeks, do you want to make a visit? And he said, no, I don't want to make a visit in 2 to 3 weeks. How about next business day? Monday? Yeah. So he showed up at some airport. I think we figured out it may have been Hanscom Airport. He showed up. He kind of shows up early in the morning, 8 o'clock, something like that. Bruce, myself, Al sit down. And after the end of 2.5 hours, with the lines along the lines where Al asked Bruce, well, how much money does it cost to produce a 7 Tesla? Bruce said, $1 million a Tesla. There was a deal. Now we had to wait to kind of put the application together, but that was amazing how rapidly it happened. And there was a lot of amazing stuff that happened from this positive momentum. At the same time, the brain model raised a lot of questions. Or with humans, there's a broad preference kind of portfolio that gets diminished with addiction. We can't talk about that with animals. Animals and addicts can't see the negative consequences of things that they do, and we couldn't necessarily see that with our brain model so far. There's also a lack of insight and empathy that comes about with addiction, and we couldn't incorporate that into the model. this model basically led to the larger issue of what is the mind? And a lot of people might say, well, it's just the brain, but no. And I'm going to use this analogy from doing app development, which is actually one of the apps I developed. You actually have to talk about behavioral specification, whether it's a mind map or a wireframe development. Both of them actually have to happen. And then how that gets connected down to actually ultimately a microprocessor, whether you use an API or not. In this context, you can talk about one in terms of the circuitry. The other one, you can talk about this in terms of computational behavior. The mind and the brain are very fundamental. Okay, so let's talk of some of the positive things happening around the 7T. Because of the 7T, we had a lot of incentive to start going after whether this was a common system. So we ended up doing, Bruce had asked, was this in 1.5 or 3? Bruce, it was 1.5. The pain studies were also done at 1.5. But the aesthetic studies and the monetary studies were done at 3T. We started to see a very common set of activations from this that started arguing that this is a common circuitry. That was a very good positive. One of these positives also was working with Danny Kahneman. He actually came up and collaborated with us for 4 years. We published this work showing monetary gambles activate the circuitry of reward just like cocaine in a very similar fashion. We published this in 2001. Anders had a massive impact on this. And sure enough, a year later, he gets the Nobel Prize. It was total serendipity. But this was a very nice impact and momentum toward things, because it then led to another funding bolus out of Al for actually doing this Phenotype Genotype project. Now, the Phenotype Genotype project ostensibly was going to be focused in on seeing groups of cells and how they related down to the genetics. That was the focus. Phenotype, genotype. I didn't expect that there was going to be a red state solution that came out of this that actually became very interesting in and of itself. What came out of it is we started seeing patterns in human behavior. And keep in mind, we were doing a key press-like response that was an operant type of response. We started seeing these behaviors that didn't really look like human behavior. These had routinely R squares above 0.9. As most of us know, doing human behavior research, it's rare that you see R squares above 0.9 on a routine basis. We didn't believe this, but everything we did didn't change things, even multiple experiments. Ultimately, we realized that it incorporated fundamental ideas of reinforcement learning, prospect theory, mean variance theory, alliesthesia, into one mathematical substrate. Now, why is this important? Prospect theory and mean variance theory, both of them are the basis of 2 Nobel Prizes. Reinforcement learning and alliesthesia are the core construct for most of neuroscience work with animals. So we started to realize that something was very interesting there. At Mass General, we basically uncovered this set of equations that they could also link to group behavior. At Northwestern, we actually dug into it, realized that there were state-based responses that were quite consistent. There were sets of traits that allowed us to actually see very consistent clustering behavior. These traits had very interesting relationships. By the way, this is not physiology. That actually is human behavior. 4,000 people in one study. We're also able to integrate this type of framework with other constructs, such as signal detection theory for attention. 4 distinct layers that were very interesting. When you actually put it all together, there was a function space for how people make preference decisions that is amazingly complex. In fact, people often think that preference is kind of like a black and white thing. You prefer one thing over another. Well, it turns out the core constructs of logic, from asymmetry to completeness to transitivity, are all violated by this mathematics. And it kind of gets to this idea of being irrational, what kind of came about from behavioral economics. Dan Ariely often signs off his letter saying, irrationally yours. There's a reason for that. At our core, we are highly irrational. And these equations are underlying that. Well, these equations, as we were pulling them together, got the interest of another guy named Dale Mortensen at Northwestern. He'd just gotten a Nobel in 2010, ostensibly for using something, a multiplicative power law, to talk about labor relationships. He asked us if we could actually take one of our variables from reward, another variable from the relative preference piece that actually is a memory variable, and integrate it with signal detection theory. So we took some old data from the Phenotype Genotype project. Turns out it modeled this equation that links signal detection with relative preference. It's a multiplicative power law indicating that the coefficients are less than 0.5 when you have them together. So human behavior is highly inelastic. It explains how you get from a non-probabilistic variable to a probabilistic one, because the beta is probabilistic. But it also had a very, very interesting outcome. loss aversion, which everyone thinks is about 2, you overweight losses relative to gains, is hardwired and doesn't change. Well, it turns out it does change, and it changes on the basis of the signal detection variable. You can actually, when you're down in the noise with a very low beta, you have loss aversion. But if you're wealthy and you're up out of the noise, you have minimal loss aversion. So this was a fascinating finding. It also kind of led us to start wondering, what then does this mean for thinking about the mind in general? I had always kind of grown up with this idea from Marvin Minsky that the mind was a set of modules. You could go from kind of reward, memory, attention into judgment, decision-making, planning, and output systems, and information would come in and come out. Well, maybe it was actually a function space. I just borrowed this kind of standard model in physics from Guth. Fascinating process in and of itself, but it may be that behavior is a big function space. Or maybe it's something where it's a combination of these types of modules with their own function spaces. The problem with this type of formulation is, how do you know how many functions to use? How do you connect that back to another ground truth? The basic fact of the matter is, you need to have something like high field imaging to get at the microcircuits that deal with these equations. So some other data using imaging that actually helped with this. Doing some work with the NFL Spring League, we actually had put together kind of a working memory task with this reward task. And sure enough, we found that when you start getting disruption of white matter fibers, you can start seeing that the beta and signal detection for working memory changes. You have fewer, your correct hits go down, your arrows go up. That shifts the beta here, so you start going down into a range where you have serious loss aversion. And as loss aversion goes up, you actually start to see symptoms of depression, addiction, things like this. It actually produces a very nice metric around why, when you have injury to the brain, such as from football, you might actually start to see these types of symptoms. Another study, and this is a study done at 3T and is another indication of why we need to be going to higher field. We started looking at the slope of the negative value function. We call this S minus. We found that it fit with the slope for the fMRI activation, also with the volume. So looking at amygdala activation, behavior, volume, we saw a wonderful triangulation. But look at this blobology. We need to get to higher resolution. And this is the definition of pseudocolor phrenology. We've also started getting at this issue of what happens when you go from microRNAs to brain imaging to virtual reality-based behavior that's mathematically discrete. And we've actually been able to show the microRNA levels relate to regional perfusion, to balance. And in fact, the brain imaging mediates the level of microRNA with the balance. Now, you might look at this and say, though, this is kind of interesting. But what's really radical about this is these are actually football players 4 months out of the football season who haven't been hit. Their microRNA levels are elevated at the level of people who have acute concussion. They basically have chronic inflammation, and it's mediated by regional activation in the putamen. This is where I'd like to see things go, but we need higher field imaging, better specificity of the microcircuits. Ultimately, what it comes down to is the importance of connecting behavioral function spaces to neural ones. Now, one caveat to this, a lot of times we go in and do spotology. We kind of do localization of things. And I'd like to kind of point to 2 fundamental pieces about kind of an argument against localization and just thinking about things as localization as opposed to thinking about the language of circuits and the language of behavior and how these 2 languages, like layers of computer languages, interact. Sidney Brenner mapped out all 302 neurons in C. elegans. This is published in 1972. We still do not know how this neural system functions at all. Conrad Korting with Jonas actually did another wonderful piece entitled, Could a Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor? They applied 16 different types of neuroscience techniques, the MOS 6502 microchip. They tried to figure out what that chip did. And no matter what they did, they couldn't figure it out. They found out some cool aspects of this chip, but they could not predict that it actually was the Donkey Kong game. What this points to is just by doing neuroimaging or mapping, we're not going to understand behavior. We need both together, linked together. All right, let's talk about this last kind of piece, linking computational behavior to AI and to high field imaging. Again, you would think that this would be obvious, but the fact is we still minimally involve computational behavior with regard to AI. So what is AI? Well, by analogy to thinking about cognitive science, where you have in just judgment decision-making, pattern identification and decision-making, with AI, it's all about feature extraction and classification, okay? What does this mean? It means that you take some type of feature extraction, whether it's doing semantic, image morphology, first order, second order stats, or talking about lawful functions. It means you put that as input into a classifier, whether it's a topological data analysis system, n-dimensional clustering like k-means, the support vector machine, decision trees, or neural nets. This is by far the most popular right now. Doesn't have to be the most powerful though. So what we just started doing is taking a look at feature extractions, having to do with semantic inputs, lawful functions. We've done work with TDAs and clustering. We're about right now, we've just formalized a collaboration with Eglos Kosteglos. I love that name, but he's a major AI person at Northwestern to actually swap out reinforcement learning from what goes on with regard to AI. So reinforcement learning is a major classifier used with regard to AI. This is the matching law, this is temporal discounting. Both of these functions are involved in the standard function used for reinforcement learning. It turns out that it may be a poor approximation for actual circuits in the brain. You need high field imaging to replace this simplistic function with something more complex and something more like what is going on to produce all the behavior that we produce, our adaptive capabilities. When you take a look at what happens with regard to connecting computational behavior to AI itself without imaging, we've done a whole number of very interesting collaborations, one with Northwestern looking at topological data analysis and feature extraction to predict whether somebody has mental illness, whether they have psychopathy, predicting types of things that you might not think are that important, like ad responses, e-com, point use, bad driving. This was actually fascinating. We did it with Uber. Actually be able to predict your FICO questionnaires with finance, all right? And ultimately, the stuff that I love is looking at social events, satisfaction, and I'm building out a dating site right now. Well, what we want to do, and we've got proof of concept, we can actually take how people swim through language, how you actually put texts and posts on Facebook and Twitter. We can take that information and put it into a relative preference format. We can take relative preference equations and actually start predicting who is healthy versus who has depression. The point here is you put these two together, you could have an automated quantitative assessment of neural and mental health. All right, so the main point here, and the dinger went off, so I'm gonna finish, is there's a very strong case to be made that computational behavior is important for AI, but I think a linchpin in here is going to be high field imaging. Yes, I've got Tesla envy, and then Northwestern out in Chicago with no high field imaging. I told Bruce I'm leaving. I want to go someplace where there's high field imaging, by hook or by crook. So I'm loading up my wagon in the next 3 to 6 months and going someplace where there's a 7T. Thank you.